안녕하세요. Outgrowing God, Richard Dawkins. Page 112. Seventh commandment: Thou shalt not commit adultery. That sounds straightforward enough. Don't have sex with somebody if either of you is married to somebody else. But perhaps you can imagine circumstances where it should be relaxed. Like when somebody in an unhappy and long broken marriage falls deeply in love with somebody else. As we'll see later, some people think moral rules are absolute and unbreakable under any circumstances. Other people think rules should be relaxed depending on the particular case. Anyway, many people would say that each individual's love life is a private matter and not a matter for commandment, stuck up in a state courthouse as though it were a law of the land. Eighth commandment: Thou shalt not steal. As with thou shalt not kill, there seems no objection to putting this up in the courthouse. Stealing, like murder, is against the law in all countries anyway. Ninth commandment: Thou shalt not bear false witness against the neighbor. Yes, indeed. Don't bear false witness against, that is, tell lies about anybody, neighbor or not. Again, it's a cornerstone of the law that witness, especially when under oath, must tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. 10th commandment: Thou shalt not covet the neighbor's house. Thou shalt not covet the neighbor's wife, nor his manservant, nor his maidservant, nor his ox, nor his ass, nor anything that is the neighbor's. Covet is a somewhat outdated word for envy, with the added element of seeking to possess the envied thing or person. It can be hard not to envy somebody who is much more fortunate than you are, but it's surely not a matter for the law, so long as you don't actually go out and grab the thing you covet, even though according to some political revolutionaries might be justified. They think the state is justified is seizing private wealth and using it for everybody. I'm not a communist or an anarchist, but perhaps you can see where they are coming from. Other people who call themselves libertarians go to the opposite extreme. They think that even taxation is a form of theft, robbing the rich to pay the poor. The legendary bowman Robin Hood did exactly that, and he has a certain romantic appeal in some quarters, like his more modern equivalents, the Wild West Jazz James and the Irish highwayman Willie Brennan. By the way, notice that the 10th commandment counts the neighbor's wife and his servants among his possessions, like his house or his ox. What do you think of the idea that a woman is the property of some man, one of his possessions, a thing that he owns? I think it's a horrible idea, but it has long been deeply embedded in many cultures, and we still see it today in places such as Pakistan and Saudi Arabia, where it is sanctioned by the state religion. Some people, not I, think that's a enough reason to respect it. You may have heard the phrase, it's part of their culture, with the implication that we have to respect it. Saudi Arabia, as I write, has only just passed a law allowing women to drive. A married woman is still not allowed to open a bank account without her husband's permission. She is not allowed out of the house unless accompanied by her husband or by a male relative. Who can be a tiny male child? Just picture the scene. A grown woman, university educated perhaps, has to ask her 8-year-old son for permission to leave the house. And he has to come with her to serve as her male protector. Those woman-hating laws are inspired by Islam. I can imagine that if the 10th commandment were pinned up in an American courthouse, plenty of women would have something to say about it. At very, at very least, we might add, in the interest of equality and moving with the times, thou shalt not covet the neighbor's husband, nor her jaguar, nor her doctoral degree. Well, of course, the Ten Commandments are out of date. It's unfair to blame the Bible for being written thousands of years ago when men owned their wives, and their most prized possessions were their slaves. Of course, we've moved on since those bad old days, but isn't that the whole point? Yes, we have moved on, and that's precisely why we shouldn't be getting out our morals, our right and wrong, our do and don'ts from the Bible. And as a matter of fact, we don't get them from the Bible. If we did, we'd still be stoning people to death for working on the Sabbath or for worshipping the wrong gods. But some may say that's just the Old Testament. Let's get our morals from the New Testament instead. Well, yes, that might be a better idea. Jesus said some pretty nice things in the Sermon on the Mount. For instance, certainly very different from anything in the Old Testament. But how do we know which statements in the Bible are good, which bad? How do we decide? That decision has to be based on something outside the Bible. Otherwise, it's circular reasoning unless you invent a rule like later verses supersede earlier ones. By the way, Islam does have exactly that rule. But unfortunately, it ends up going the wrong way. The Prophet Muhammad said some quite nice things during his earlier time in Mecca. But later, after he moved to Medina, he became, for reasons to do with the historical circumstances, much more warlike. Many of the awful things done in the name of Islam can be justified using later Medina verses in the Quran, which contradict and supersede, according to the official doctrine, earlier nicer Mecca verses. Back to the Christian Bible, there is nothing in it that says, forget about the Old Testament, just read the New Testament to find out what's right or wrong. Jesus could have said that. In fact, Matthew 5:17, he said exactly the opposite. Do not think that I have come to abolish the law of the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. I tell you the truth, until heaven and earth disappear, not the smallest letter, but the least stroke of a pen will by any means disappear from the law until everything is accomplished. Also in Luke chapter 16, verse 17, it is easier for heaven and earth to disappear than for the least stroke of a pen to drop out of the law. The law to a Jew like Jesus meant certain books of the Old Testament. Jesus seems to have taken a rather rosy view of the Old Testament. In Matthew 7:12, he states the rather nice principle which we know as the golden rule: treat other people the way you'd like them to treat you, and goes on to say it is the central message of the Old Testament. So in everything, do to others what you would have them do to you, for this sums up the law and the prophets. It's true you can find something that sounds a little bit like the golden rule in the Old Testament, and you can find older, more precise versions of the golden rule in texts from ancient Egypt, India, China, and Greece. Do not seek revenge or bear a grudge against one of your people, but love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. Leviticus 19:18. But it's great exaggeration to say it's the main message of the Old Testament. As we saw in chapter 4, God was himself pretty expert at bearing grudge. And there's any number of verses of the Old Testament which preach vengeance. If anyone injures his neighbor, whatever he has done must be done to him, fracture for fracture, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. As he has injured the other, so he is to be injured. Leviticus 24:19. By the way, that's another thing that comes straight from Babylon. In this case, the code of Hammurabi was a renowned Babylonian king, and his rule book was written down about 1,000 years before the Old Testament. Here's another version from the Bible, the book of Deuteronomy. Show no pity, life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot. Deuteronomy 19:21. I suppose you could say it's a kind of negative version of the golden rule, but it doesn't sound so nice the negative way round, does it? Jesus himself, Matthew 5:38, went out of his way to say the opposite, even quoting that very verse from the Old Testament. You have heard that it was said, eye for eye and tooth for tooth, but I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If someone strikes you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. And if someone wants to sue you and take your tunic, let him have your cloak as well. If someone forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2 miles. I don't think there's ever been a clearer or more generous repudiation of the idea of vengeance. It puts Jesus far ahead of his time and far ahead of the Old Testament God. Yet Jesus himself was not above vengeance. even discounting the stories in the infant Gospel of Thomas, the canonical Gospels of both Matthew and Mark tell how he took revenge on, of all things, a fig tree. Early in the morning, as he was on his way back to the city, he was hungry, seeing a fig tree by the Lord. He went up to it, but found nothing on it except leaves. Then he said to it, "May you never here bear fruit again." Immediately the tree withered. Matthew 21. Matthew 21:18. Mark's version 11:13 adds that the reason there were no figs on the tree was that it was too early in the year. Poor fig tree, it was simply not yet the fruiting season. Christians are understandably embarrassed by the story of the fig tree. Some say it never happened, like the stories in the infant Gospel of Thomas. Others just ignore it and concentrate on the nice bits of the New Testament. Yet others say it was symbolic. There never was an actual fig tree. It was some kind of metaphor for the nation of the Israel. That's a favorite Dutch of theologians. Had you noticed? If you don't like something in the Bible, say it's only symbolic. It never really happened. It's a metaphor to convey a message. And of course, they get to choose which verses are metaphors and which are to be taken literally. There are other places in the official Gospels where Jesus comes across with some of the nastiness of his Old Testament father. In Luke 19:27, he says of people who don't want him to reign over them as their king, "Bring them hither, and slay them before me." Rather surprisingly, in view of Roman Catholic worship of his mother Mary, Jesus himself was not very nice to her. On the occasion of his first miracle, turning water into wine at a wedding feast, when his mother approached him, Jesus said, "Woman, what have I to do with thee?" Perhaps it sounded less cruel in the original Aramaic than when translated into the English of the King James Version. One of the modern translations, the New International Version, sticks deer in front of woman, which at least changes the tone for the better. A classical scholar friend tells me the Greek word used here for woman can sometimes have a sort of dear meaning. And to be fair, since the whole story of turning water into the wine certainly isn't true, there's a good chance Jesus' parent put down of Mary at the wedding didn't really happen either. Whether it happened or not, this is not the only story where Jesus comes across as a surprise choice of role model for family values. If anyone comes to me and does not hate his father and mother, his wife and children, his brothers and sisters, yes, even his own life, he cannot be my disciple. On another occasion, Jesus was speaking to a crowd of people and was told that his mother and his brothers were waiting, hoping to have a word with him. Again, put down, someone told him, "Your mother and brothers are standing outside, wanting to speak to you." He replied to him, "Who is my mother, and who are my brothers?" And he waved his hand towards his disciples and said, "Here are my mother and my brothers." Matthew 12:48. At other times, Jesus comes across as not so much bad as ignorant, and in a not very nice way. In the Gadarean region, Jesus came upon a pair of men possessed by demons. Matthew 8. They were so violent that no one could pass that way. Probably schizophrenia, schizophrenia then or some other mental illness, but Jesus followed the false belief of his time, the belief in demons. He commanded the demons to come out of the man. But now the demons had nowhere to go, so he told them instead to enter a herd of pigs that were feeding nearby. The demons did, and the poor pigs, now known probably as the Gadarean swine, stampeded headlong over a steep cliff and drowned. Not a nice story. Of course, I wouldn't normally blame a man of the first century for ignorance of mental illness. Judging people of an earlier time by the standards of your own time is one of the things good historians just don't do. But Jesus was supposed to be no ordinary man. He was supposed to be God. Shouldn't God have known better? Jesus was not a bad man, simply a man of his time. Imagine how impressive it would be if Jesus had said, "Verily, verily, I say unto you, there are no demons, nothing that could fly out of man and into pigs. This man has an affliction in his head. There are no demons anywhere." Even better, imagine how impressed we'd be if Jesus had told his disciples that the earth orbits the sun, that all living creatures are cousins, that the earth is billions of years old, that the map of the world changes over millions of years. But no, his wisdom, impressive though it was in many years, was the wisdom of a good man of his time, not a god, just a man, though a good one. And imagine how impressed we'd be if the Prophet Muhammad, channeling God, had said, "Oh believers, the sun is a star like any of the other stars in the sky, just much nearer than them. It seems to rise in the east and travel across the sky till it sets in the west, but truly it is just the earth spinning which makes it look that way. Alas, no. What he actually said was the sun sets in a marsh. Or suppose Elijah, or Aisha had said, "Hear, O Israel, the word of the Lord your God. The Lord has revealed to me in a dream that nothing can travel faster than light. Instead, all we get from them is orders to worship only one God, plus lots of other rules for how to live, all things that might occur to men of their own time." You can find some nice verses in the Bible, some even in the Old Testament, though not many in my experience. But how do we decide which verses to ignore because they are nasty, which verses to promote because they are nice? The answer has to be that we have some other criterion for deciding, some method of judging that's nice and what's nasty, a reason that doesn't come from the Bible itself. But then, whatever that criterion turns out to be, why don't we just use it directly? If we have some independent criterion for deciding which biblical verses are good and which bad, why bother with the Bible at all? But you may say, it's all very well talking about an independent set of standards. It does seem to be there, but what is it? How do we, as a matter of fact, decide what's good and what's bad? And therefore, incidentally, which verses of holy books are nice and which nasty? That is the subject of the next chapter. Chapter 6. How do we decide what is good? Like all other animals, we humans are the product of hundreds of millions of years of evolution. Brains evolve like all other parts of the body, and that means that what we do, what we like doing, what feels right or wrong, also evolve. We inherit from our ancestors a liking for sweet things and a yuck reaction to the smell of decay. We inherit evolved sexual desires. All those are easy to understand. In moderation, sugar is good for us, although too much is not. We now live in a world where too much sugar is readily available. But this was not true of our wild ancestors on the African savanna. Fruit was good for them, and many fruits contained moderate amounts of sugar. It was impossible to get too much sugar, so we evolved an open-ended appetite for it. The smell of decay is associated with dangerous bacteria. It benefited our ancestors to avoid decaying meat, and that included a reversion to the smell. It's obvious why we evolved a desire for the opposite sex. Sexual desire leads to babies, and those babies then carry the genes that give them sexual desires when they grow up. We are all descended from an unbroken line of ancestors who mated with a member of the opposite sex, and we have inherited their desire to do so. But now for something less easy to understand, we seem also to have inherited the desire to be nice to other people, to be friends with them, spend time with them, cooperate with them, sympathize with when they are in distress, help them when they are down. The evolutionary reason to be nice is hard to explain and must wait until chapter 11. After the chapters on evolution itself, meanwhile, I can only ask you to accept that niceness of a special limited kind is part of our evolutionary heritage, like sexual desire, and it probably feeds into our sense of right and wrong. We have evolved moral values inherited from our remote ancestors, and yet that can only be a part of the answer to the question that has this chapter. This must be so, if only because our view of right and wrong changes as the centuries go by, and changes on a historical timescale much too fast to represent evolutionary change. You can see it as the decades go by. It's almost like something in the air. Of course, it isn't literally in the air. It's a combination of lots of things. So it sort of feels like in the air because it can't be pinned down to any one place. The dominant moral values of the 21st century in which we are now living are noticeably noticeably different from those of even 100 years ago. They are even more different from those that prevailed in the 18th century. Then keeping slaves was simply what people did, including my ancestors in Jamaica. I'm sorry to say, and they thought civilization would collapse if the slaves were freed. The great Thomas Jefferson, third President of the United States and the main author of the U.S. Constitution, kept slaves. So did George Washington, the first president. Let's at least hope they and my ancestors didn't know the appalling conditions in the ships that transported the slaves from the West Africa. By the way, it wasn't just white Europeans and Americans who took slaves from Africa. While Europeans were taking slaves from West Africa, Arabs were taking them from East Africa. Swahili, which has become the dominant language of Equatorial East Africa, developed as the language of the Arab slave trade. It contains many words of Arabic origin. African chiefs also kept slaves themselves, as well as capturing and selling them to European and Arab traders. Not surprisingly, since the Bible's morality was of its time, slavery is not condemned there. Even the New Testament is full of exhortations like, "Slaves, obey your earthly masters with respect and fear, and with sincerity of heart, just as you obey Christ. Obey them not only to win their favor when their eye is on you, but like slaves of Christ, doing the will of God from your heart." Ephesians 6:5. Here's another. All who are under the yoke of slavery should consider their masters worthy of full respect, so that God's name and our teaching may not be slandered. The reversion against slavery which we feel today is just one example of a change in the air. Abraham Lincoln, another of America's most rebirth president, was Charles Darwin's exact contemporary, born the same February day in 1809. Darwin was passionately against slavery, and Lincoln actually freed the slaves in America. Yet it would not have occurred to either Darwin or Lincoln that Africans could be the equal of what they called the civilized races. Darwin's friend Thomas Henry Huxley was an even more obviously advanced liberal thinker. Yet in 1871 he wrote this: "No rational man, cognizant of the facts, believes that the average Negro is the equal, still less the superior, of the white man. And if this be true, it is simply incredible that when all his disabilities are removed, and our prognathos relatives has a fair field and no favor, as well as no oppressor, he will be able to compete successfully with his bigger-brained and smaller-jawed rival in a contest which is to be carried on by thousands and not by bites. The highest places in the hierarchy of civilization will assuredly not be within the reach of our dusky cousins. And President Lincoln said this in 1858. I will say then that I am not, nor ever have been, in favor of bringing about in any way the social and political equality of the white and black races, that I am not, nor ever have been, in favor of making voters or jurors of Negroes, nor of qualifying them to hold office, nor to intermarry with white people. And I will say, in addition to this, that there is a physical difference between the white and black races which I believe will forever forbid the two races living together on terms of social and political equality, and in as much as they cannot so live, while they do remain together, there must be the position of superior and inferior. And I, as much as any other man, am in favor of having the superior position assigned to the white race. Truly, whatever was in the air in the 19th century, something very different hovers about us today. It's a poor historian who would condemn Lincoln and Darwin and Huxley as racist. They were near to being non-racist as men of their time ever got. They were men of the 19th century. If they'd been born 2 centuries later, they'd have been horrified by those two quotations. You don't even have to wait 1 century to notice a change in moral values. In chapter 5, we consider the bomber bomber crews who, on both sides, slaughtered masses of civilians in the Second World War. To start with, the bombings focused on industrial centers like Coventry in Britain and Essen in Germany, where arms were being manufactured. Bombing was inaccurate in those days, and civilians' casualties were inevitable. But both sides resented their civilian deaths. They retaliated. They retaliated, and later in the war, the bombing raids were scaled up. Civilian casualties ceased to be a byproduct and became the objective. Between 13 and 15 February 1945, 722 British and 527 US planes flattened the ancient and beautiful German city of Dresden with high explosive and fire bombs. The exact number of civilian casualties will never be known, but realistic estimates put it at more than 100,000. That's comparable to the figures for each of the atomic bombs that destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945. Now move on half a century, and happily there are still wars, but there are they are nowhere near so terrible as the two world wars. In the two Gulf Wars, although there were still civilian casualties, these were treated as unfortunate mistakes. Politicians apologized for them and explained that they were collateral damage, byproducts of attacks on legitimate military targets. It's partly that electronic technology has advanced. Guided missiles, which with state set, satellite control, and other navigation systems can cruise accurately to a particular address keyed into their onboard computer. Very different from the indiscriminate bombing of Dresden, London, and Coventry. But the moral climate in the air has moved on too. In the Second World War, people like Hitler and Marshal of the Royal Air Force Sir Arthur Bomber Harris positively wanted to kill civilians. The modern equivalent of Bomber Harris, his last complimentary nickname in the RAF was Butcher Harris, go out of their way to apologize when a civilian is killed by a stray missile. Can you believe how recently women were first allowed to vote? In Britain, women gained the same voting rights as men in 1928 up to 1918. No woman could vote, and then only those who had reached the age of 30 had met certain property and or educational criteria. At that time, men could vote at 21. The United States gave women the vote in 1920, finally catching up with various individual states within the Union. French women couldn't vote till 1945, and Swiss women not till 1971. As for Saudi Arabia, don't even ask. The point is that something changes, something spreads in the air, such that as the decades go by, the things that people find acceptable change dramatically quickly. Before women had the vote in Britain, nice decent men could be heard saying things like, women are sweet and pretty and all that, but they can't think logically. They certainly shouldn't be allowed to vote. Can you imagine anyone saying that nowadays? My friend, the psychologist Steven Pinker, has written a great, in both senses, book called Better Angels of Our Nature. The title is quote from Abraham Lincoln. He shows how, over the centuries, over the millennia, we humans have been getting nicer, gentler, less violent, less cruel. The change has nothing to do with genetic evolution and nothing to do with religion. Whatever is in the air has been moving in what we can broadly see as the same direction from century to century. It's the same direction, but is it the right direction? Well, I think so, and I expect you do too. Is that only because we are 21st century people? I will leave that for you to decide. But when, in chapter 4, we judged the God character in the Old Testament, we were judging him by the standards of our own century, just as a good historian doesn't look down on Abel Lincoln for his racial prejudices. So the historian might hesitate to think the words of the God character for the truly terrible things he did to Isaac at the hands of his father, for instance, and to Jephthah's daughter, and to the poor Amalekites and the other tribes whose land of milk and honey the Israelites were told to covet. The God character in the books of the Old Testament was acting out the moral values that were in the air at the time. But Although we may make allowances for his moral values, or rather the moral values of the Jews in the Babylon who wrote the Old Testament, that doesn't stop us resolving firmly to do things differently in our time, and we are entitled to oppose those fundamentalists of today who try to drag us back to those times. Right then, moral values are in the air and they change from century to century, even decade to decade. But in addition to our evolutionary past, where do they actually come from, and why do they change? Partly the changes come from ordinary conversations in cafes and in pubs and around dinner tables. We learn from each other. We hear stories about people we admire and vow to imitate them. We read novels or opinion pieces in newspapers, listen to podcasts or speeches on YouTube, and change our mind. Parliaments and congresses debate questions and change the law step by step. Judges interpret the law in ways that change as the decades go by. 감사합니다.